were people who thought that they wanted the system managed better, and that they'd lost confidence in the Republicans as stewards of the system, but that they were not necessarily looking for a restructuring of the United States. I think part of what we've seen politically in the U.S. since January has been President Obama sort of coming to grips with this change. We'll see where it goes. I think he has an opportunity to teach and to maybe build a constituency for a transformative presidency, but he'll have to do that step by step rather than being able to get it all done at once. The Europeans, I think, shared these illusions that were widespread among Americans, but also had some other errors of their own. And this may be worth talking about to kind of encapsulate some of the problems that we see cropping up in U.S.-European relations now. I think it's actually worth looking at French-U.S. relations, which are passing through one of their all too frequent low points at the moment. Not lowest of the low, but definitely as one reads from Paris, there is a certain acerbic quality to the assessments of President Obama's statesmanship of late. I understand a panel is planned soon for "Is Obama a Weak President?" in Paris. So if we look at what why President Sarkozy should suddenly feel the need to let many of his close advisors, associates, and the international press know that he has some problems with Obama's leadership, we can see, I think, a pattern on Obama's side of ways in which statements by the American president really crossed important French interests. The first being the statement on the abolition of nuclear weapons at the United Nations General Assembly. For France, the possession of nuclear weapons is not an evil, it is a good. It's an important part of the country's independent posture in world affairs. It's a constitutive element of France's claims to great power stature. Delegitimizing nuclear weapons is not a popular thing to do. Number two, we then find the U.S. Treasury Department saying, you know, the G7 is really no longer that important. It's going to be basically the G20 from here on out. We are moving rather quickly to take a small elite club in which France is a leading member and replace it with a much larger grouping in which France is perhaps in the second tier of members politically, if not necessarily economically yet. And finally, we have the call from the Treasury Department that among the needed reforms of the IMF Board of Directors would be the abolition of the French Directorate at the IMF. What I think was particularly annoying, perhaps, or would annoy me if I were French, and so I suspect it also annoyed the French, is that this was not a this sort of triple whammy, we might say, was not a calculated insult. It was an uncalculated insult. That is to say, behind all of these decisions, it's fairly clear that there was no one in the senior circle in the White House suggesting to President Obama that while all of these might be wise policy choices, if you're going to roll them out in a short period of time, you ought to think about how you do it and perhaps consult and discuss before you act. And so what we see, I think, is that it's not so much an ideological hostility toward Europe or toward France that might have been expressed in a recent administration, but a studied indifference to relations with France. A sense that that's not where the big, that when you're thinking about big issues in American policy in world terms, there are a number of telephone numbers that you don't need to call, and one of them takes you to the Élysée. So, this, I think, gets us to where many Europeans hoped that Barack Obama's election would make a turn in U.S.-EU relations based not on atmospherics, but on closer consultation and coordination of policy. And I think so far this has not borne fruit. From the Obama administration's point of view, in fairness, it's safe to say that when they've asked for help, Europe, particularly on Afghanistan, Europe has not been particularly forthcoming, nor perhaps can it be. But again, from the American administration's point of view, there's the sense that the difference between the Europeans helping you and the Europeans hurting you is maybe not so great. And therefore, the time one spends on European relations should be proportionate to that fact. Now, I think that's wrong. I think it's a mistake. But I think we are seeing in the Obama administration, not even at the level of conscious intent, but much more powerfully at the level of unconscious assumptions, this vision has taken hold. Looking forward, I think we are going to see that the Obama administration, like the Bush administration, and indeed like all American administrations, has to confront a key problem. And that is that as the world is changing, influence, power, and energy seem to be passing from Europe to Asia. And that the American position in the world is changed by this, but not altered, if that makes any sense. That is, that the U.S. is still the sort of a unique global power in the international system. But while its Atlantic relations were the core of its international strategy and relations in the 21st century, the Pacific is likely to be the core of the American project in the 21st century, whatever that turns out to be. And furthermore, because the U.S. is deeply concerned with, and Obama more than Bush, with the health of international institutions and their workability, that means that the U.S. is going to have on its policy agenda the task of reducing Europe's voice and place in international institutions in order to make way, first of all, for more Asian voices and influence, and in the second order, more generally, for other emerging developing world powers like Brazil. And this, the U.S. doesn't want to accelerate this. It regrets, I think, on the whole, the necessity for doing it. But to the extent that Americans are internationalists and multilateralists, that will not make them as instinctively Atlanticist in the future as it did in the past. And I think to some degree there was a sense, a hope in Europe in any case, that with the election of a multilateralist American president, we would be going back to the days in which multilateralism in America primarily meant, and almost indeed exclusively meant, relations with the great European powers. I don't think that's what Obama believes multilateralism is. I think Japan, China, India. I'm actually reminded, and maybe I'll close with this observation, something that Henry Kissinger once said to me. I think he said it to other people too. I don't claim any unique authority for this, but he said, if you look at world geopolitics, the consolidation of the European Union is less important than the unification of Germany. The unification of Germany is less important than the collapse of the Soviet Union. And the fall of the Soviet Union is less important than the rise of India and China. And I think the assumptions and world outlook behind that statement are likely to permeate American foreign policy going forward. And this means for both Europeans and Americans a need to rethink our relations. I continue to believe that a strong Euro-American relationship is one of the fundamental building blocks of world order. But we have to think intelligently and clearly among ourselves and with one another. What does that mean in a new century and with a new geopolitical map of the world emerging?